So I wanted to ask at this point if there are any comments, questions, reactions before we go into our discussion questions from the curriculum. Yeah, Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, Rabbi Gary Zola, who is of the American Jewish Art, who's the curator of the American Jewish Archives, for a long time was at HUC, and he's a good friend of early Kol Hadash. He was very helpful with our congregation early on. But the HUC in their library has a collection that includes some of the artifacts from the Geniza of Cairo. And Gary was very generously gave me a tour of that. And I was able to see that a number of years ago. But if anybody wants to, it's only as far as Cincinnati.
Yeah, it's a lot easier than Cambridge, where Schechter had everything shipped. You know, and again, like with our modern understanding of cultural relics and treasures, should he have shipped it to Cambridge? You know, should it be repatriated to Egypt? Well, there aren't a lot of Jews left there, and would they, you know, have the access to study tools that we would have now? Well, maybe not. But the flip side is, you know, he sort of took the Geniza and shipped it thousands of miles away instead of burying it in the cemetery, which is actually what they wanted to do at some point.
Yeah.
Others?
Yeah, I have a question. What about intermarriage?
So, intermarriage, you mean with the Islamic world? Yeah, so it was an interesting dilemma because Islamic identity claimed to descend from the father. So the father would define the religious identity of the child. And so you would have this odd paradox where if a Jewish man married a Muslim woman, the kid was neither. Because the Jews wouldn't accept it with the Muslim mother, and the Muslims wouldn't accept it as Muslim with the father, and then vice versa, where they're claimed by both because the Jewish mother makes the Jews claim them, and the Muslim father makes the Muslims claim. Now, it was not a very common phenomenon. Okay, again, when you have a religion that's empowered and a religion that's in a subordinate status, generally, if there's going to be a marriage, it involves conversion. And since you were not allowed to convert out of Islam into something else, it was most often a case of a Jewish woman converting to Islam and marrying a Muslim man. But it really was not a very large phenomenon in this time and place. So it wasn't really a common issue. Now, there were these examples I mentioned of sort of inter-Jewish intermarriages between the Karaites and the Rabbinites, and that created certain tensions. But by and large, the communities lived parallel, separate lives. They mixed at certain times and not at other times, but sometimes they had very collaborative experiences. I'll give you one example. In Morocco, there's a wonderful tradition at the end of Passover called Mimuna, where the non-Jewish neighbors bring breads and cakes over to their Jewish neighbors at the end of Passover, because they know that the Jews can't bake yet because they just, you know, were just released from the prohibitions on chametz, on leavened bread, but they make it sort of an intercultural exchange where they give them their first taste of bread and cake afterwards. So it's a wonderful example of sort of, you know, positive synthetic collaboration between the communities. That didn't lead to intermarriage, you know, but it led to some kind of cultural dialogue between the two. And Jews in Morocco often adopted the culture of worshiping graves of saints, which is part of the non-Jewish community practice, but there are examples of Jews doing that in the Moroccan community. Some of them even still make pilgrimages back to Morocco to do that. And we'll be doing more now that they're normalizing relations between the countries. But intermarriage was not really a key problem, certainly in this early period. So the first one is, how did the Muslim conquest affect Jewish life religiously, economically, and socially?
Well, I can answer some of that.
Some people have advanced degrees in this.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much. So, but obviously, Jewish life under the Muslims initially as a protected community was much better than it was under Christianity, where they tended to be oppressed, especially after Constantine and so forth. Economically, they opened up a lot of possibilities for them because they were able to travel freely within the Islamic areas, whereas in Christianity, they were often not permitted, and they were restricted to certain kinds of professions and not permitted to do a lot of other things. Socially, well, they, as long as they paid their taxes as a dhimmi, they were permitted to, have a Jewish community. And that changes. It depends on the time period and the place you're looking at. But generally speaking, in the sort of classical Muslim times, under the Abbasids, for example, the Jews did pretty well, and they had some self-government even within the Jewish within the community, because the dhimmis were permitted to govern themselves within the overall overarching of Islamic law, but they were allowed to apply their own laws as long as it didn't conflict with Islamic law.
Right. And the Reish Galuta, this what's called the exilarch, actually was recognized by the Caliph as the head of the Jewish community and all of the diaspora. So that was an official representative at the court. And they were, of course, centered in Baghdad, which was very good choice of location if you want to have influence on the early Caliph court. One other niche I didn't mention earlier on is that the Jews were actually able, as much as they had a common enemy with Christendom, they also were able to play the intermediary between Muslims and Christians, where a Jew could travel from Egypt to Italy, where a Muslim couldn't do that trip, and a Christian couldn't go from Italy to Egypt and back because of the religious war between the two. But Jews were sort of a neutral third party and could make their way back and forth between the two. And so that, of course, also gave them some opportunities. I mean, most Jews were not international traders. They were local craftsmen and merchants. They were living a much more domestic pedestrian life. But, we focus on the exceptional cases because they're a lot more dramatic and interesting.
Well, for example, the Black Sea community, which existed, which was a trading community of Jews that really operated between the Muslim areas, Istanbul, Constantinople, which then still was the Byzantine Empire. But there's a very interesting description, for example, of Viking life by a Jewish traveler who actually sees them up in these areas in Novgorod area, and the Jewish traveler is actually describing one of the few descriptions we have of Viking life before the Christians. With sort of Viking religion and things, and so that's sort of gives you an example of what the rabbi is talking about. Yeah,
definitely. And obviously, in this period, I'm sorry, was someone else jumping in?
I just had a question, but
No, let's go ahead.
So when I was reading in the textbook, it talked about Jews were often the bankers for the caliphate also, which I found interesting because history continued to repeat itself. And so what was going on in that time, that was what I wasn't clear about, that gave them that advantage and allowed them to become the bankers, because they were the merchants and the traders, is that they had the money?
That's part of it.
And I can go ahead and point out, I Muslim has a very strict usury, religious usury laws that that's way beyond the rules in Judaism. So I mean, even now in Muslim countries, they'll have, special Islamic banks where instead of like getting loans with interest, it's actually like an investment in the property and stuff. So I imagine that was a big part, that Muslims just were forbidden from engaging in a lot of banking practices.
You weren't allowed to lend at interest. The way it worked in Christian Europe was both Jews and Christians read the Hebrew Bible rule that says do not lend an interest to your brother, but you can lend an interest to the stranger, to mean that Jews couldn't lend an interest to Jews and Christians couldn't lend an interest to Christians, but Jews could lend an interest to Christians. So that's how they were able to become bankers in Christian Europe, because of that loophole. And then, as Rin pointed out, in Islam, lending an interest of any kind was thought to be terrible. And so they have to work out partnerships or other kind of arrangements to deal with finance. Actually, I read a very interesting book about religion and tax law, which doesn't sound like an interesting topic, but I found fascinating, that points out that because of Islamic finance, they're actually discriminated against in the tax code because the way they do mortgages is not deductible because they're not using conventional interest as we would understand it, even if they wind up paying that amount. So anyways, it's an interesting quirk of the modern tax law as it applies to interest. But yes, Jews were able to become the bankers. Also, honestly, when you have a banker who's a foreigner, sometimes it's useful, because if you're the ruler in charge and you decide you don't want to pay back all that money, you say, well, those Jews are getting too uppity, or and you find ways to get out of it. And being the money lender is not a particularly comfortable position either, because you're at high risk. It's one of the reasons why interest rates were so high. Plus, this is an era where investments there's no such thing as AAA rated bonds. Investments are haphazard. You put money in a ship, it could sink, it could get captured by pirates. Who knows what's going to happen to it. That's why interest rates were so high, because you didn't know what would happen. Interestingly, one of the major charities of this time period, documented by the Geniza and other sources, was the Redeem the Captives Fund. Because if you were on a ship that was taken by pirates and they landed at a port, they knew that Jewish communities would ransom the slaves who were Jewish off the ship, so they actually didn't kill the Jews right away. They allowed them to survive so they could be ransomed at the next port. And you would contribute to the Save the Captives Fund, because who knew when your cousin was on a ship in somewhere else that was going to be ransomed there and able to return home. But that's the realities of doing business in an era where insurance didn't mean anything. Okay, second question. What was the status of Jews under Islam? Why do you think the existence of a Jewish state with Arab subjects would be a provocation to some Muslims, given this piece of history? So this is this whole concept of the dhimmi, the tolerated minority, right? So they had some restrictions, limits on where they could live at times, what dress they could wear, their status, how successful they could appear on the outside, how demonstrative they could be in their religious practices. But as long as they lived subordinate, they could live well.
Islam has a concept of two worlds. One is the world of war, and one is the world of peace. And the world of peace is those areas that where Muslims control, where they are the dominant community. And the world of war is the area in which other groups control. And Muslims can move into those areas, and they often did as traders. But the intent was always that at some point down the line, this area should become a Muslim area and run by Islamic law. So it's very provocative to have a Jewish state which is the dhimmi community, with Muslims in it, which were supposed to be the people to control it. And it's a reverse situation, and that's intolerable in Islamic thought.
Right. Well, that's why I use that phrase uppity. It's often, if you think back to the Jim Crow era, it was used in the phrase uppity Negro or worse. Think about the American carpetbaggers in the American South after the Civil War. They were supposed to be subordinate, and here they are trying to be in charge. So this came out actually very recently. There was a ceasefire between Gaza and Israel, one of several, they've started and stopped over the decades. And at one point, Hamas said, yeah, we can come to an agreement with Israel as long as they agree to live under the banner of Islam. And I thought, I know what that phrase is all about. As long as they accept being a dhimmi, they can stay, that's fine. But there's no way that the model of dhimmitude, which was a very tolerant model for the Middle Ages, is going to be acceptable to modern day Israelis. Now, I mean, Israel has its own issues with how it treats its Muslim and Arab minorities, and certainly the occupied Palestinian populations surrounded in Gaza and directly occupied in most cases in the West Bank. So that's a issue of, who's uppity now and who's the dominant minority and who's discriminating. Unfortunately, power corrupts, as we know. But we can see how having any kind of a Jewish state under, in Arab territory, as it was understood, or in the heartland of the Arab Empire, because remember, that was one of the first places conquered, was Mesopotamia and the land of Israel. So this is not Spain. We're not talking Afghanistan or India here. We're talking the heartland. We're talking Jerusalem. And to have Jews in charge with Muslims and Arabs under them, that's not the direction that history is supposed to go. Okay, third question. Who were the leaders of the Jews under Islam, and what were the advantages or disadvantages to this structure? So you recall we had that three-headed committee, you've got the Reish Galuta, the exilarch, the king of the exile, and then the heads of the rabbinical academies, the Geonim, and they were confirmed by the Arab Caliph. Advantage, well, centralized authority is a good thing. Disadvantages? What might you imagine would be the disadvantages?
Well, if someone else wants to answer. Otherwise, I'll just say that the disadvantage, of course, is that these people all have to be confirmed in office by the Caliph, which means that if the Caliph doesn't like you, if you have some other ideas or you decide to do different things, you're constrained very strictly by the structure. So you are then cease to be the exilarch and someone else gets to be the exilarch.
Or if they make a nice little donation under the table, or
yeah,
there's all kinds of ways.
Yeah, the little hakshish, yeah. Bakshish.
I will also add, I mean, just the sort of nature of a problem with a non-elected authority for a large and diverse population has inherent problems in it with, what happens when you get a not so great ruler, or a ruler who's, fine for this little group over here, but the rules are really not that great for, how the Moroccan Jews want to live.
This is a very large territory in a very primitive time in terms of travel, communication, technology. And yes, it's stable, but it takes a long time to get from one end to the other, and so to spread word and to get rulings enacted and so on, that's very difficult to do. In some cases, decentralized authority might have been a little bit more effective. The other challenge you have is, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to work in a co-CEO arrangement. I tried for 1 year being a co-rabbi with someone else. I'll just say it was not a success. So the point is that sometimes it's hard to have three people who are all in charge, right? Two of them supposing to be religious authorities, who are both the highest religious authorities from two different academies. I mean, it's sort of set up for conflict and for rivalry and ultimately for splits. And so that takes us to the fourth question. Over what issues did the Karaites split from Rabbinic Judaism, and how does their story challenge traditional accounts of Jewish history from this period? So what was the major split?
Well, it's kind of like, if you will, fundamentalism versus, the Karaites saying the text is the text, and this is what we do. And they're very similar to the Wahhabi, actually, in the sense of going back to the original Quran. So we go back to the original text. This is what it says. This oral thing is ridiculous. You're making that up just to justify what you want to do, and your interpretations of these things. We need to go back. So that's the initial split, is between those that are textualists, originalists, if you will, versus those that have this oral Torah and everything that comes out of that.
Yeah, Ren, you were going to.
It's also like the Abu Judea tribe in Africa. They were a tribe that Christian missionaries taught the Bible, and they became so fundamental, they threw out the Christian portion of it and started following only the Old Testament. And ultimately, they became a very, very fundamentalist tribe, almost got wiped out in Uganda, but they were absolute textualists.
Right. Interestingly enough, the Karaites actually did develop their own schools of interpretation too, because just saying read the book isn't enough. You still got to sort of say what it's trying to say here. But their interpretations hew a lot more closely to the text. So, for example, the whole idea of milk and meat being eaten separate, that's a rabbinic concept that they claim is from the do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. But even the rabbis admit that there are certain laws which are mountains hanging by a hair. You've got just a hair to the text, and there's a mountain of laws, and that's one of them. And the Karaites would have said, cut that hair. Like there's no milk and meat separation. So their dietary laws even are going to be very different. Now, what this challenges in traditional accounts of Jewish history was, remember, the rabbis claimed the oral Torah has always been there. It's always been accepted. It's part of the mainstream of Jewish tradition that goes back to Moses on Sinai. And so the fact that the Karaites are saying, no, you just made it up, is disagreeing with that rabbinic claim. And the fact that they were able to be convincing to a number of people suggests that maybe it wasn't all the way back to the beginning of time, and the existence of other communities that have, like, my understanding is the Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, have the Hebrew Bible, but not the Talmud. And they would have the Talmud if it had gone back to Moses on Sinai, but it doesn't. It goes back to the rabbis in the rabbinic period. So this is one of those cases where the Karaites point out both that the rabbis are making it up as they go along, and are probably right about at least a good chunk of that, and that there's no one way to be Jewish. Just like in the Second Temple period, we had the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Hellenistic Jews, and even in the early rabbinic period, we still had surviving Hellenistic Jews in different communities further out from Baghdad and Babylon. And finally, the Babylonian Talmud compilers and teachers say, yes, we can authorize one version of Judaism for everywhere. And within 100 years, here come the Karaites, and they don't want to listen. So we have been a stiff-necked, stubborn people for a long time, and it applies to our own leaders as well. Or you can use the line from Henny Youngman. Some people think that we're a pain in the neck. Others have a lower opinion of us.
I have a question. How did the Karaites deal with the fact that the latter part of Exodus, for example, Leviticus, for example, all dealing with the tabernacle and sacrifices and the priests and all these things, which they're clearly not going to be able to do, considering there are communities that are spread around, the world as well. You want to go back to originalism, but you what do you do with the laws about all the flocks belong to God, and you got to take them to, as sacrifices at the temple and so forth?
Well, there's no temple. Remember that if they're using the whole Hebrew Bible, the destruction is part of the story too, right?
Okay.
And the Babylonian exile and the return and the promise of rebuilding and the prophetic book. So they're just assuming, ironically, a bit like the rabbis, that there'll be a return and a redemption of some kind. Not in the rabbinic interpretations of what the Messiah is and where it comes from, but in some version of a return and rebuilding of the temple. I'm not as well versed on the Messianic overtones in Karaite theology compared to rabbinic Judaism, but it is an interesting question. Why is all this stuff still in there if we can't do it now? And what are we studying here? So they had to come up, like, look, they didn't want the rabbinic version of the Passover Seder, but they're not going to kill the animal without a temple in Jerusalem and the priests there. So they got to come up with their own kind of Haggadah, even if it's going to be different than the rabbinic version of the Haggadah. Okay, next one. Why was the Cairo Geniza such an important discovery? And is this more or less important than the Dead Sea Scrolls? And why are the Dead Sea Scrolls more famous?
Well, I just want to say I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are more famous because I think that they're more noteworthy to the Christian majority. The Dead Sea Scrolls were like, oh, look, we can learn more about, things in our early Christian kind of stuff. Well, the Cairo Geniza is very much a Jewish find.
Well, and Islamic find too.
And Islamic find.
Right. I mean, it's actually really useful because it gives you a sense of the economic activity of the Muslim world, not just of Jews specifically.
And I mean, the Cairo Geniza may be much more famous in Egypt than the Dead Sea Scrolls, for all I know. I'm only speaking from an American point of view.
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly seem to be a lot older, and so I think, there's a certain cachet about the fact that something is very, very old, and wouldn't that make it really, really important versus something that was newer? And although it is certainly, I mean, I hadn't heard about it until we read about it this session. So, again, it's a well-kept secret, I guess.
Yeah, and it's we talked at the beginning of this unit about how the Middle Ages get overlooked. The Cairo Geniza is about the Middle Ages. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, not in academia, obviously, but in popular understanding. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are from the time of Jesus and late antiquity. And so the context for that gets a lot more attention than, what's happening in medieval Egypt.
I was just going to say that, but the Dead Sea Scrolls though have religious significance more, because they're the earliest versions of some of the texts that are in both the Christian and the Jewish Bibles, and the Geniza stuff that's an anthropological, gold mine, and if you're interested in medieval life in Cairo and in the, and so forth, so on, that's great, but most people not so much.
Also, I would point out that it's the Cairo Geniza is social history rather than intellectual and religious history. And, until the last 50 years or so, social history often got short shrift compared to the intellectual or the big events and wars and battles kind of history. It's also, by the way, one of the wonderful improvements to our historical understanding wrought by feminism, because if you want to find women in these earlier periods, you have to look at the social history, because they weren't allowed to participate in many cases in the political and the wars and major movements kind of history. So, this is a shift in our historical emphasis that has opened up the importance of a Geniza like this. And again, getting private letters and commercial documents and communal minutes of meetings and inventory sheets. I mean, it's wonderful information that we find fascinating, but again, 100, 200 years ago, they might not have found as interesting. And so then the last question, the lachrymose, neo-lachrymose issue, was life for Jews under Islam better or worse than it had been under the Christianized Roman Empire? Why or why not?
Well, I mean, I think there's of course it depends, but overall, it seems to be generally better. It's a more of a structured, tolerated minority rather than constantly having to fear that the Christian neighbors are going to decide to get all zealot again and decide to have attacks on the nearby Jews or run them out of the country, which happens quite periodically.
Yeah, ultimately, the Jews didn't kill Muhammad.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right, Roger. I mean, there is a religious basis for anti-Semitism isn't really the right word, because that's a later concept, but for an anti-Jewish, from a religious standpoint, right up until the 18th century, there's a very strong religious basis for Jew hatred, and you don't get the blood libels and all these sorts of things that appear in medieval Europe, but in Islam, not very often anyway. I mean, there are occasional exceptions, but nothing like what's going on in Christian Europe.
Yeah, I guess you don't get a Paul in Islam that really likes to appeal to the Hellenistic anti-Judaism in the conversion attempts like you do in early Christianity.
Well, and also we have to remember that under Islam, Jews were not the only religious minority. There were also Christians around, and in many cases, Muslims were the minority in a territory where the majority was Christian plus Jewish, if you added those together. So it lent the Muslim rule to be a little bit more tolerant, because they couldn't be more oppressive if they were the numerical minority. And the Jews were not the only target. Where in Europe, the pagans were wiped out. The only non-Christian population in many cases around you were the Jews. And they were seen as a uniquely superseded group, where Muslims have superseded both Christians and Jews and are very sort of self-confident about it because of their massive conquest and success. So they weren't so nervous, they didn't have to lord it over them all the time with, constant demonstrations of their power and persecution, where in Christian Europe, it was much more of a popular sport, we'll put it that way, to blame the Jews. And as Roger said, blaming Israel and blaming the Jews and his blood be upon us in the gospel, I think, of Luke, is an ongoing spur to anti-Jewish sentiment, because the Jews as a whole are seen as guilty for the death of Jesus in a way that isn't. Muhammad dies in his bed. He is not seen as killed in the same way. Although, again, there are some passages in the Quran that are read in a very anti-Jewish way. There are other passages that are read to encourage toleration. Again, you have to pick which of these examples are you going to use. And then when you get into the Hadith literature, the deeds of Muhammad stories, well, again, some of those are more tolerant and some of them are appalling. About the rock cries out, "Kill me, the Jew is behind me," and they're calling them the sons of dogs and pigs and monkeys. And I mean, there's really obnoxious stuff there. And again, it just depends on which strand are you going to draw on. There's a passage in the Quran that says there is no compulsion in religion. And then there are other strands that suggest maybe later in Muhammad's career, that was an earlier statement when he was on the bottom and didn't have a lot of power. He didn't want there to be compulsion in religion. But when he gets power, maybe he's more willing to impose it. So this is the dilemma of any generation. And I hosted a conference once, this is now in 2007, on Jews in the Muslim world, solving the puzzle. It was actually a conference that Sherwin Wine had organized, planned for October of 2007, and he was actually in Morocco that summer in July when he died in a car accident. And so I had to step in to help run this conference with a lot less of the background that he had in the subject, but I read every presenter's book that they had, so at least I knew what they were going to talk about. And part of my concluding talk was what lesson can humanistic Jews offer to Jewish-Muslim dialogue? Because we're not going to emphasize that we both pray multiple times a day and we both have a one-line statement of faith. It's called the Shema in traditional Judaism. It's the Shahada in Islam. We both point our prayers at one direction. We to Jerusalem, them to Mecca, which from North America is more or less the same direction. We don't have, that isn't our sense of Jewishness to create common ground with Islam. But maybe what we can offer is the importance of interpretation, the importance of choosing which texts you're defining as the authoritative ones and which ones have been superseded, the importance of a historical perspective, and most importantly, and I'll end with this, what I called the joy of sects, S-E-C-T-S. Because once you can tolerate other versions of your religion, as we have Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Humanistic, Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic, and they don't always get along with each other or recognize each other, but enough of them do that we can have varieties of Judaism that tolerate each other, so then we're more likely to tolerate people of another community as well. It's what I call the joy of sects. And so that's what I wished on Islam as well, that if they can discover the joy of sects with a more liberal Islam, a more revisionist Islam, or reform Islam, whether it's built in the Islamic diaspora or finds roots in Islamic countries that are more liberalized, that will ultimately lead to helping to resolve conflicts between Jews and Muslims, because if you can tolerate the heretic in your own community, you can tolerate the one who disagrees with you from some other community.